Senator Cassidy.
Secretary Zinke, thank you for being with us. Appreciate it. In your comments, you mentioned the advantage you have growing up in the West and understanding the importance of appropriate measures for fire suppression. Well worth, I think, the $1 billion or so that you're putting forward, and I kind of compliment you for that. What I bring up now is my advantage of growing up on the Gulf Coast and kind of a lead-in into that. Obviously, the budget takes the GOMESA payments for the Gulf states for oil and gas leasing, and the budget states the administration proposes to repeal these revenue-sharing payments to ensure the sale of public resources from federal waters owned by all Americans benefit all Americans. Now, as you know, beginning in 2018, oil and gas revenues for Gulf states are set to increase to $375 million, with an additional $125 being distributed to the stateside Land and Water Conservation Fund. Now, what you may not know, which of course I do, being from Louisiana, in our state, these revenues are constitutionally required to be put towards coastal restoration. Again, I was struck that you mentioned that it is a prudent approach to remove dead and dying trees, and so it justifies, if you will, the money for fire suppression. Totally agree with that. I guess the point I would make is that it is a prudent approach to rebuild the Gulf Coast coastline. Otherwise, we're paying for more Katrina-type recoveries. Just a couple comments on this, though, if you will, the federal role in this. Our coastline began to erode when the Mississippi River was dammed, if you will, levied, for the benefit of inland commerce. So all those ports up and down the Mississippi benefit because our land is levied, and since the year those levees began, our coastline has begun to recede. So the benefit, which is nationwide, and I agree it should be nationwide, the penalty for that is borne entirely environmentally by our state. Now, if you will, that's where I would see the kind of federal obligation. So let me just show you, since I mentioned that the money that we receive has to be used for our coastal master plan. Can we put the first poster up? This is our coastal master plan, 120 projects which would reduce flood damage by $150 billion, creating 802 miles of land. The green space is where the land will be produced. When the hurricanes come towards New Orleans, every mile of wetlands lost allows that storm to be that much stronger, destroying, if you will, levee walls, flooding out homes, creating obligation for the American taxpayer for that, as we saw with Katrina. So if we don't have these dollars, this can't happen. When we met before your confirmation, you had mentioned you'd gone to Congressman Scalise's offshore energy visits and saw how we use those funds for our restoration. We also know that our coastline has refineries and pipelines that are the energy coast, if you will, for our state. So can we go up to 2 and 3? This is what is going to happen if we don't take action. If we don't have that revenue to rebuild our coastline, this is the high-end scenario. 50 years from now, red is the land that is lost. And if we have it, we can, this is a future medium scenario. That's the worst. This is medium. So even medium, we can see an incredible vulnerability for New Orleans sitting right here as all this wetlands is lost, and therefore the ability to buffer storms hitting our coast. And then I can just kind of go, and by the way, this is all energy coastline, so our nation depends upon the refineries and pipelines here. The price of gasoline rises in the Northeast when our pipelines are put out of business by a large storm. So I guess my question, you've mentioned desiring to be energy secure. That, of course, depends upon our offshore revenue and development, but also depends upon those pipelines and refineries to take that oil and gas. So I guess first question, how does removing those GOMESA funds away from Louisiana help fulfill that energy dominance? Secondly, I will say that you had mentioned the need to address the debt and deficit. I will point out that if we do expand revenue sharing and development off Alaska and the Atlantic coast, which those states are frankly incentivized to participate in by sharing the revenue with them, we will increase revenues for the nation as well as for those states, and increase the number of good-paying jobs with more people paying taxes out of good-paying jobs. So I guess the second question, would you support legislation that expanded revenue sharing to the Atlantic states, Alaska, and the rest of the Gulf of Mexico if lease sales were scheduled off their coast in the next 5-year plan?
Well, thank you for your question. And you know, Montana and Louisiana are very similar, that the water starts in Montana and makes its way down to the Missouri or Mississippi. And I know more about red snapper than I ever cared to sitting next to Congressman Graves. But I understand exactly what you're talking about on this. And the budget does take the tact. And again, this is the first step of what a balanced budget would look like. But the budget before you looks at a balanced budget in 10 years and where the revenues come from. The position of this budget is the revenue goes into Treasury. Clearly, the position of Louisiana that is inappropriate, and I understand exactly, well, you know, between the differences on it. What I can say is that I'll work with you on it. Certainly, I understand the importance of Louisiana. We think that the taking 94% of the offshore assets offline has had a significant detriment to revenue of Interior. And when you have a lot of money, you know, the choices become easier. But when you drop $15.5 billion a year in revenue, much of it from offshore, much of it from the Gulf, some of it from Alaska and other holdings, it has a significant creates a significant issue on funding. So I'll work with you on it, and I'd be glad to.
Sounds good. Thank you.